Hi, everybody. I wanted to take a chance here to do a brief lecture here, giving you some more information about John Dewey. He's the most important theorist of education we've ever had in this country, and one of the most important in the world. Influenced the education systems of many different countries, as well as with his other writings on philosophy and the arts and political science and other kinds of things. So a very important theorist, and in part because he was writing at a time when it was still seen as legitimate for people to write about lots of different topics. Today people specialize in a certain area, and each academic discipline carves off his turf. And so people will either do political science or psychology or philosophy or aesthetics, etc., or other kinds of subdisciplines. Dewey did all of those things and researched and wrote in many different areas. This was the time when he was just getting started, again, before all the academic disciplines had fully formed. So that's one of the reasons. And definitely, has been influential. He's referred to often. Those of you who are planning to become teachers or thinking about becoming teachers, you're going to hear Dewey's name mentioned quite a bit. And it's helpful, I think, to have a pretty strong background of understanding in his ideas. And that's what I'm hoping to offer here for you in this lecture. And part of this as well, I'll be going over the section of interest and effort in education that was assigned for your reading, and just explain that a little more in depth. Dewey's not known for being a very easy person to read. He's very abstract in his writing, and his particular rhetorical style is a little old-fashioned and does make him a little challenging to understand. So I just wanted to go over some of that with you. So just some background material. And I'm going to pop up here briefly a picture of Dewey. I know there was one in the text, but this picture is helpful because it does show how popular and well-known he was. You can see this is from a cover of a Time magazine with Dewey's picture on it, obviously, reflecting the fact, again, that he was what was considered at the time a public intellectual. And there's still a tradition of being public intellectuals in this country, though it's not as strong as it was in the early mid-20th century, and even back into the late 18th century. Public intellectuals were people who were, again, intellectuals, right? They were researchers, they were writers, they were scholars, but they also engaged with the public frequently with their thinking. Probably the best known early public intellectual in this country was Ralph Waldo Emerson, right? Who was a scholar, but also popularly did lots of speeches for different groups of people. His ideas were relatively widely known. And the same thing was true of Dewey in his day. And of course, you wouldn't find today most academics on the cover of Time magazine, right? So you can see again that Dewey was very popular, very well known. He lived between 1859 and 1952 until he was 92 years old. He was writing up until he died, and teaching till shortly before then. Born in Burlington, Vermont, which was a city where there was quite a bit of immigration. It was an industrial city. So Dewey did witness a lot of immigrants coming into the country, a lot of diversity, socioeconomic diversity, as well as diversity in terms of what the immigrants were bringing into Burlington. But if you think about those 92 years, 1859 to 1952, he's born, right at the outset, essentially, of the Civil War, and died after World War II. Imagine what kind of change you would have seen in the world between 1859 and 1952. It's really incredible to kind of imagine, right? Abraham Lincoln being president and then dying when Eisenhower's president. And that's another thing I think that makes Dewey interesting and makes his writings interesting. He did write his whole life, starting in the late 1800s. And he was writing over that time of so much change in the nation, so much change in the world, change in technologies, change in the demographic makeup of the nation, of the size of the nation, all these kind of things. Again, I think contribute to Dewey being, really interesting and really important as a writer, as a thinker, etc. So his writings about education, as I said, are particularly important, obviously, for our purposes. If you look in, just Google Dewey's name, you'll find all kinds of information, lots of his writings, references to his writings. He wrote volumes and volumes of material. I think his collected volumes are something like 32 of them. It's an incredible kind of output, scholarly output for someone. He was writing virtually all the time. Again, his writings on education are particularly important and particularly relevant for us. And so I'm going to pop up here a slide. And again, you can find many of these in Google. If you go to Google Dewey's name or just Google images in Dewey's name, just to help you understand a little bit his ideas about education, his ideas about thinking. His writings about education are really based in his view of human experience. And you could tell that in reading in the Tozer book, right? That everything for him begins with an experience. So he was an empiricist. He didn't believe that we're born with any innate ideas, though we do have, are born with certain kind of developing cognitive abilities. So Dewey was very much a developmentalist. He shared some similarities with Jean Piaget, who many of you will read in your developmental psych classes. Though Dewey's ideas about how knowledge and meaning were created were, I think, more social than were a lot of Piaget's ideas. But they worked with thinking. They also both really, and again, you could see this in the Tozer text, recognize that human beings are basically and foremost biological beings, right? So this desire to communicate, to create, to be expressive, to kind of experiment with the world, as it's sometimes put, is something we're born with. It's how we learn to survive, right? Unless we learn, we can't survive. We have to find out about our environment. We have to be able to problem solve in our environment, to be able to feed ourselves and make clothes and stay safe and all those kinds of things. And if we don't do that, obviously we perish. If you think about it and look at the different kinds of animal life that exists in the world, those animals who are more simple, more basic in terms of their size of their brains and their nervous systems, tend to have lots of very specific instincts to help them survive, right? Think about birds, for example, and the instincts they have that allow them to survive and, build nests and take care of their young and fly south for the winter, right? Those things are all kind of hardwired into them. When you move up the food chain, as it were, to animals that are more developed with larger brains, they tend to have instincts as well, but those instincts tend to be a lot more basic, right? Those instincts are not as specific, which is because those kinds of animals can problem solve, right? They have the ability to figure things out for themselves, as it were, both individually and as social creatures. But it all begins with experience, right? And we're always kind of in contact with the world, as Dewey liked to say, always interacting with the world. And so everything kind of begins with experience. So you'll see at the top of this diagram, concrete experience, doing and having experience. Doing is again what we all start out with and are doing all the time. We're acting on the world in one way or another. Not always mentally, typically physically, right? We're breathing, for example. We're seeing things. We're trying to make sense of things, etc. And having experiences. Our baseline experiences, Dewey said, are not intellectual, right? They involve kind of a feeling. They involve kind of having experience qualitatively, right? And it's when we are going out through our days And most of it we're able to do through habits that we develop, so we don't have to stop and think. Thinking about driving your car, tying your shoes, all the kind of things that you learn how to do when you're younger that you just can go through your day and do without having to stop and think about it, right? So there's no real cognitive intellectual activity going on. But we do run across those situations that we find ourselves in where we do have to stop and think about things. We don't have habits to help us solve all of our problems, right? And we experience new situations all the time, or we have experiences where our old habits don't work anymore, right? You know how to maybe drive the automobile that you're familiar with and can just focus on where you're trying to get to and not how the car operates. But if you find yourself having to borrow a friend's car, all of a sudden you have to stop and think about things, right? Where are the controls? And go through a kind of a learning process there. So you'll see that arrow on the top leads to the down to the right-hand side, reflection, observation. That's what happens when you have to stop and think about things. When your habits that you developed don't allow you to continue with what you wanted to do, well, in your kind of workaday life, and you have to stop and reflect on things. First of all, you have to figure out where's the problem here. Why is what I usually do not working? Or what is it about this new situation I find myself in that I have to learn about it before I can function effectively in it? It's one reason that people will sometimes not want to put themselves in situations they're not familiar with. It's uncomfortable, right? And it's that feeling of discomfort that makes you have to stop and think about, how do I make this situation work? How do I function in it? How do I problem solve in it? How do I make sense of it, right? So that leads to reflection and observation. It's the teacher's job, right, to create those kind of experiences or the environment for those kind of experiences for their students, right? And you try and create experiences for them that are developmentally appropriate, right? You wouldn't put a young person in an environment where they were going to be overwhelmed by it and not have any of the tools they need or cognitive abilities or anything yet to really be successful in it, any of the life experience to be successful in it. So you try and put them in environments where there's something new they have to kind of figure out, but it's not too far beyond them, right? And that's why you develop lesson plans and unit plans and things that are developmentally appropriate, but challenging at the same time, right? You'll talk about something related to a Soviet psychologist who we didn't really learn about until the fall of the Soviet Union, whose ideas were very similar to Dewey's ideas, in fact, who talked about something called the zone of proximal development. And that zone of proximal development is the location where things are not too easy to be boring, but too hard to be impossible. So you try and find where that zone of proximal development is for your particular students, right? You spend the early part of the school year trying to figure out what are they familiar with, what have they experienced, what are they interested in, right? Because you know that's what you want to build on, right? With their experiences that they already have so they could learn more. So you can help them develop new habits, new problem-solving skills, right? And you need reflection and observation to do that, right? And at the bottom of the chart here, you see abstract conceptualization. That's when you have to try and, you're trying to figure out, okay, what's the problem in the environment? Why aren't things working? And you have to do some abstraction from your situation and conceptualize things. You have to use ideas, right? There's a famous clubhouse that Dewey students created at his laboratory school, which they mentioned briefly in the book, and I'll talk a little more about that. It was a school for Dewey to kind of try out his ideas. It was an elementary school. It was part of his contract with the University of Chicago when he began there on the faculty, where he was had a position in philosophy, psychology, and education, or pedagogy, as they call it at the time. Pedagogy is just another word for teaching. And they wanted to build a clubhouse, right? And to build a clubhouse, they would have to study different kinds of dwellings, right? What is a clubhouse? What kind of a structure is it? They had to figure out the materials that they needed, the science of the materials that they needed. What kind of wood are we going to use? How are we going to cut the wood? How are we going to measure? There was mathematics involved. And then they had to actually physically create this structure, right? So they were learning about the typical parts of the curriculum, mathematics and social studies and science, but they were doing it to create this project that was something that was, that they all wanted to do, that they were interested in doing. And that's what would allow them to make it through the problem-solving activities, through some of the tough times, right? Where you have to stop and think and figure things out, and sometimes it's difficult. And so this is where the abstract conceptualization comes in, where they're having to stop and think, okay, what kind of structure do we want to build? What are they? Let's investigate. What kind of materials are available? How do they work? What are the best kind of materials for us to use, right? And then the active experimentation side, trying things out. Planning, once you've said, okay, here are the materials we're going to use, here's the kind of structure we want. And actually having to firsthand try out the materials and experiment with things to actually successfully build the clubhouse, right? And again, I would remind you, for Dewey, yes, education is all about experience. But for Dewey, all there really is in human beings, certainly when we're conscious, is experience, but it's the kind of experience that's important, right? And for Dewey, the kind of experience that's most important, especially for young people, is firsthand experience. You don't just read about materials and science and mathematics. You do them. Firsthand experience, right? Or concrete experience, as it says here, is what's sort of most important. And again, an example I used was this clubhouse the students built. This is what for Dewey is called the new psychology, right? Or constructivism. And in the Tozer book, it distinguished between the faculty psychology of Jefferson and Mann and the new psychology or constructivism, as we call it today, of John Dewey and also Charles Eliot. Eliot was also involved with this new psychology. And they're almost complete opposites, as you can see from reading about them. Faculty psychology, you were basically a passive learner. There was a lot of memorization involved. You were sitting for long periods of time at a desk that limited your movement intentionally, right? It's like you do when you exercise muscle groups and the different faculties that Jefferson talked about, for example, memory, reason, and imagination were like different faculties, like muscle groups. And so you isolate those muscle groups to exercise them, which means you don't want the body moving at all. So traditional school desks were designed to really limit your movement. It was also very, very asocial. Yes, everybody's doing the same thing, reading out of a textbook or listening to a lecture from the teacher, but they're all doing it by themselves, right? Interest doesn't matter, right? Sometimes the idea was if it's harder for you, it's better for you, right? Not all of life's going to be interesting. So we ignore interest and use traditional curriculum, Greek and Latin, even though most people weren't going to use it because it was thought to be good to exercise your brain, exercise your memory, reason, and imagination. And there are traditional kinds of studies, right? As I said, it didn't really engage the body at all. It wasn't hands-on. It was intentionally not hands-on. The new psychology or constructivism was almost the exact opposite in every way. Interest was important. How do you really engage students? It does not mean students do whatever they want. That's an important thing to understand. And it's kind of a myth about Dewey. Dewey became associated with a kind of progressive education that was just completely hands-off. Students do whatever they want, unguided by adults. That's not what Dewey was talking about, right? You want to use adult knowledge and wisdom as part of the social environment for young people to guide their learning, right? You worked with these basic impulses they have to create, instruct, express, etc., right? But you try and guide them in the right direction. That's why I emphasized the importance of creating the right kind of learning environment for young people, right? So it's in between complete rigid structure of faculty psychology and complete lack of structure, right? It's the middle ground between the two. And it's harder to do, right? It's easier to just have all kinds of rigid structure and have students sitting quietly all the time, or just give them paper and pencils and materials and say, go at it, do your own thing, right? Guiding them with the right amount of structure, the right amount of feedback at the right time is harder to do. But that's the middle ground that Dewey's talking about here. So with this new psychology, again, interest does matter. Hands-on whenever possible. Doesn't mean you never use textbooks, but you try and start out with hands-on material as much as possible, right? It's very social. The kids are learning together, doing activities together, because real life is social. And you have to learn how to work with other people, right? So Dewey in particular saw this kind of constructivism or new psychology he was talking about as helping you to create not just habits of problem solving in a tradition, in a traditional kind of academic way, but democratic habits, habits of working with others, taking responsibility for your actions, contributing to the group, right? Dewey would have very much liked student government because it did that, right? Learning to be a democratic citizen for Dewey, and as you can tell what I've already mentioned, it's not just about learning about democracy, which is what I learned when I was younger, right? Here's how a bill becomes a law. Here are the different branches of government, etc. First of all, it was boring. Secondly, it didn't really tell you how those things work, right? For Dewey, it's not just about learning about democracy, it's practicing democracy. And you only learn really about democracy by practicing democracy, right? So again, student government is something that he would really like. Participation, having students involved in committees and organizations of adults in schools where the student perspective could be taken into account, right? When it came to making determinations about the budget, right? Or about the kind of meals students were going to have, or other kinds of decisions, have the student voice involved, right? It's good for the school. It's also good for the students, right? Participatory democracy is what Dewey is all about here. So, this is the new psychology. This is what we today call constructivism. And remember that it's an element of the conceptual framework in the School of Education. If you look at the syllabus, you'll see constructivism mentioned there. And for Dewey in particular, to be more exact, it was social constructivism. The ideas that we develop, the knowledge that we create, we do it in a way that's either directly or indirectly social. It's indirectly social because we use language. We use things we learn from our social environment, things education provides us, things our parents provide us. It's directly social a lot of the times because we're working directly with people, right, to create knowledge and meaning, with other students, with our friends, with parents, again, with people in the community, other ways in which we interact with our teachers, right? And Dewey would emphasize, too, this idea of teachers learning along with their students, right? Knowledge and meaning aren't something just one person can possess and just give to another person. I mentioned that in my Plato lecture when I talked about the cave allegory, right? Teaching is a two-way street between the teacher and the student, and ideally both teacher and student learn from their interaction. Teaching gets really, really boring if it's a one-way street from teacher to student, because you never learn anything from your students, right? And it's dangerous because you start to always see things just in terms of your perspective and your level of understanding. It's why some of you have probably struggled with some of your professors who sometimes forget that you don't have the same interest in their subject that they do and the same knowledge of it that they do. They start to presume certain things that you don't have in terms of your background experiences and your knowledge, right? So it's really good to be learning from your students all the time. That's why, even though we're obviously doing a Zoom class that's asynchronous, I'm having you do all of these discussion questions. I learn from you, you learn from me, you learn from what the Tozer book has to offer, etc. Right? Makes it a lot more interesting for me. I constantly learn new things from my students. I teach a lot of really complex texts when I teach in the humanities program, but I reread them all the time because I learn new things from them all the time. I learn from my students all the time, their perspectives, their ideas. So that's a part of this kind of new psychology too, that Dewey would have called social constructivism, right? Constructing ideas and meanings using social tools like language and using directly a social environment. Really important for Dewey's understanding. Let me see, I didn't do this ahead of time, but let me see if I can quickly find for you and share it with you a picture of the clubhouse that Dewey's students created. So you can get a sense for what it looked like. It appears in a number of different documentaries and things on Dewey, one of which I'm going to share a link with you about. I'm looking here. I'm not seeing it. But in any case, I kind of gave you a sort of description of it. It's a pretty elaborate looking, structure for elementary students to be able to create. And it really emphasizes, and a good example of why Dewey is identified with the project method for learning, right? The idea, again, is students learn through actual kind of making things, solving problems that involve things that they have an interest in, and that will allow the teacher to bring in the various elements of the curriculum. Sometimes it's called learning through vocations, right? You're using vocational activities like a carpenter, let's say, right? Somebody who creates structures. So you're learning through that vocation, but you're not just learning to be a carpenter, right? Maybe some of the students will go on to do that. That's fine. You're not learning, though, in a narrow vocational sense, because you're also learning the math and the science and all the other kinds of elements. That's what makes Dewey different from Charles Eliot and his kind of progressivism, right? That was called social efficiency progressivism. And this was the group 5 question set, where Eliot really emphasized, for him, social efficiency meant educating people for a specific future. So they were tested with ability tests when they were young and educated for a certain vocation. Of course, what happens then is you become locked into that vocation, which Dewey didn't like at all. He thought that was very dangerous. And even more dangerous because this was the time when the poor and the new immigrants were automatically educated for vocational jobs and didn't really have an opportunity, if they would have wanted, to get the classes they need and be encouraged and supported to maybe pursue a college education if that's something that they wanted. It was legitimized in the minds of a lot of people like Eliot because they could point to these ability tests that said these students weren't, didn't have the ability to go to college, et cetera. A lot of that was because of biases and these ability tests, right? They were definitely geared towards middle and upper class students. They were obviously geared towards American culture and cultural literacy that immigrants didn't have, et cetera. So the idea was basically to sort students into their probable destinies, as the term was. for a specific vocation. And they would test kids when they were, 11, 12 years old. And then you would be locked into a certain curricular path. Again, this is educating for vocations. Dewey really did not like that idea at all, thought it was very undemocratic. Wanted all students educated broadly through vocations, through meaningful hands-on kinds of real life activities that adults do in the world, but so they could learn all of the curriculum and as they moved on in their education, eventually make a choice about what kind of future they wanted for themselves. That to him was more democratic, right? So that's what differentiates Dewey's developmental democracy progressivism from Dewey's social efficiency progressivism. Now, Eliot also did believe in this new psychology to the extent that he believed in hands-on learning and learning in a social environment, especially for the vocational students, et cetera. But it was not this learning through vocations and this developmental democracy progressive that a position that we see in Dewey. Let me talk a little more about interest and effort in education, because it's kind of the psychological mechanism of Dewey's new psychology, or his kind of constructivism. And again, I know the first chapter of his book, Interest and Effort in Education, is kind of abstract and maybe a little difficult to follow. So interest and effort, what's the relationship between them, right? So you'll see the three main bullet points here. And above that, wholehearted identifying, that's really important, right? When students are interested in what they're learning, when it's directly meaningful to them, when they're not doing it just for a grade, let's say, they're more wholeheartedly involved in what they're doing, right? The things that we do that are, maybe we identify them as just kind of fun activities that we're involved in. When people ask you, what do you do for fun? Do you collect things? Do you listen to music, whatever that is, right? We're typically more wholeheartedly identified with those things and involved with them, right? Because we're doing them because we like to do them, right? Then maybe things we're forced to kind of do. And Dewey recognized that students aren't always going to like the things they have to do in school, but he thought that they'll actually will learn better if we try to present things in a way that they can be more wholeheartedly engaged with their learning, right? So again, you'll see the bullet points here: physical, participatory, and sensory. Again, this new psychology is hands-on. Your learning is not just something that goes into your brain, but into your body as well, right? The examples I gave of some of the learning that we do, learning how to drive a car, learning how to saw wood and use a hammer to build a clubhouse, right? That learning is embodied. It's not just mental. It's not just stuff that goes into your brain, right? That's a really important idea of Dewey's here, that knowledge and meaning are embodied and become a part of our bodily being and not just our minds or our brains, right? Students using hands-on manipulatives to learn different kind of mathematical problem solving and that kind of thing. Lots of different elements of embodiedness in our learning. Toolish, constructive, right? Meaning construction, applicable and functional. You're doing things you can apply and see how they worked. This idea of experimenting with the world. You have ends or goals that you're trying to achieve, right? So you're trying to figure out what you need to learn, what you need to do to actually achieve those goals. There is that intellectual and psychological development. This is where interest is important, to find out something or figure out something, right, that you can be fully engaged with or wholeheartedly engaged with. And as I already mentioned, it's also social, right? Identification of our concerns with those of others, recognizing that what we do impacts other people. This idea of being responsible to some kind of a larger group, a social group of some kind. It starts with your family, is your initial social group, right? and then your friends, your community, your school, the larger ways in which we're nested in these different kinds of social organizations. Your state, your national, your nation, the world, etc. Appropriation of others' concerns, taking other people's concerns into account. That's what democracy is about, right? Democracy for Dewey is not majority rules in that simple way. That's something that's called tyranny of the majority. John Stuart Mill talked about it. Another writer, a French writer named Alexis de Tocqueville, talked about it in a book of his called Democracy in America. And it's a danger that we face sometimes. You'll see that that's now functioning in government. Think about the way in which whoever, for example, has the most representatives in Congress, in the House, let's say, or in the Senate, they kind of act as though they can do whatever they want. Yeah, they might, the majority might have a vote in those things, but they don't take the majority's concerns really into account. They basically say, hey, we're running the Senate now. People voted for us. We rule the Senate. We're going to do whatever we want, regardless of what the minority concern is. That is not democracy. That's tyranny of the majority. Democracy is doing your best to take minority concerns, and by minority, I mean the smaller group of people, taking their concerns into account as best you can. Doesn't mean you always do what they want, those kind of things, right? But it does mean, as it says here, appropriation of others' concerns. That's a really important idea here. It's something to think about. Lots of teachers will use some democratic, practices in their classrooms, working with their students to create classroom rules or to decide on activities, etc. And you might have a vote on what students want to do. Think about whether or not, you want to not just say, well, here's what the majority of students want to do, but find a way to maybe fold in the interests, the concerns, the perspectives of the smaller group of students, right? That maybe want to vote for something slightly different, right? That's really what democracy is about. And again, it's harder. It takes more time. Democracy is messy. Dewey would like to say, but it helps. It's better for everybody in the long term to be able to do that. Now, in terms of interest and effort, the basic idea here is that you try and present the material to students in a way that's going to be interesting. So students building the clubhouse, I'll go back to that example again. Students of a certain age would love the idea of having a clubhouse of their own, right? It's exciting. It's a goal they can all work towards. It's a big enough goal that they could be really motivated towards it. And genuine interest, as Dewey says, will create genuine effort. Genuine effort is when you are working on something, right? Really applying yourself, but you're really fully engaged. It's not like it's labor per se. It's not like you're just doing something for some external reward, like a grade or money or something like that, right? You're really fully engaged with it because it's meaningful to you as you're doing it. It's directly meaningful for you. It's fulfilling. You get a sense that you are learning, that your sense of agency and what you can do is expanding, right? It's what we call a teachable moment in education. It's the thing teachers love to see in their students, right? When you have created an environment for them and an activity that they're genuinely interested in, and you can see that they're really fully engaged in it. Not staring out the window, not looking like they're doing one thing when you're thinking about something else, right? They're really fully engaged in it. That's genuine effort. And what Dewey says should be the goal, and again, we won't always achieve this, but it should be something we try to achieve. The goal is where the learning takes on a momentum of its own, right? Genuine interest leads to genuine effort. That genuine effort and what comes out of it, what students learn, what they experience enhances their interest. And again, learning takes on a momentum of its own. Think about those activities, for example, where um, you worked on something and it felt like you were working on it a short period of time, but you actually were working on a really long period of time. And because you were so engaged, the time just flew by. It went by so quickly, right? Think about activities that we sort of like to do, games, athletics, that seem to go by too fast, right? Um, it's because we're really so fully engaged in those activities. When you're an athlete, for example, you're working hard, right? There's a lot of effort that's really involved. But the interest in it is so genuine and you're so fully engaged that the time goes by really quickly. And again, this is, it's like a target that you try to hit. You won't always hit the bullseye, right? But Dewey says if we have that as something we're thinking about and how we try and create learning environments for students, that's where their learning is going to be the most optimal. Now, he does point to what happens when we don't do this the right way. He talks about interest that's not genuine. Think about times in which a teacher has created an activity, let's say that you've been involved with, and you had a lot of fun with the activity. Involved dressing up or doing something was fun. But then looking back on it, you realize you didn't really learn anything, right? If that was not genuine interest, because the interest was not about the learning that really needed to take place, the content of what you were supposed to be learning. It was about some window dressing that was given to it, right? And I've heard lots of different stories about things that teachers have done that students will share from social studies classes or math classes where they did a fun activity and at the time it was great, and then they realized they didn't learn a whole lot from it. Maybe when it came time for a test, or times for maybe it wasn't even the teacher's test, it was a state test or an AP test, and all of a sudden they realized, gee, just that class wasn't as bad as I thought it was going to be, but now I know why. We had a lot of fun. We didn't really learn a whole lot. So the genuine interest has to be in the content itself that students need to be learning. The other way in which we can make a mistake here is when we just say, force students to make a lot of effort, but not try to present the material in a way that's interesting and engaging, right? That is really boring for students. It makes learning a labor. Only those students have a genuine interest already in the topic, an inherent interest, right, can really function well in an environment like that. So he's looking for genuine interest leading to genuine effort where it takes on a momentum of its own, right, to be differentiated from that artificial interest when things are just kind of dressed up to make them fun, right? You're learning about a certain event in history and you do some role playing, but the role playing is just really doesn't really reflect the people that you're supposed to be learning about, let's say. Or you go to an amusement park for a physics class and you're supposed to be doing some physics problems while you're there, but you don't, and everybody blows it off and the teacher knows you're going to blow it off and you just have fun, right? Foreign language class, when you do activities, cultural activities related to the language that you're learning, and you're supposed to be learning some vocabulary or something and you really don't, you're just kind of having fun, right? Or when the effort, again, is just forced effort. It's not genuine effort in that it's not something that sort of comes natural, that naturally grows out of the interest in the topic, but something that's just kind of artificially forced on you. Right? That's why that interest and effort piece of Dewey's is really so important. And it really is the internal psychological mechanism of constructivism, or as we call it in the textbook, the new psychology for Dewey. And that's where I really wanted you to get a sense for it here. So I hope that is helpful. A couple other things here I wanted to share with you. I mentioned Dewey's laboratory school. As I mentioned, he started it while he was at the University of Chicago. It was his second big academic appointment. He taught at the University of Michigan for a time. and then moved to the University of Chicago in the mid 1890s. Part of his agreement to teach there was that he would get some initial funding to begin a laboratory school. And as it says here, Dewey tested his ideas of education there. This was not a laboratory school in some kind of an artificial sense. It was genuinely a laboratory school. And it says here, Dewey tested his ideas here. Really, it was the teachers in the school tested the ideas. And they also, it wasn't just that Dewey kind of dictated to them what they should be doing in their classes for this elementary school. The teachers helped to develop the curriculum. And the teachers helped to figure out how to apply Dewey's kind of theoretical ideas to actual teaching in classrooms. So this was something teachers were fully engaged in, right? It wasn't something that was just, Dewey dictating to teachers, here, do this and do that. You can kind of see maybe from this picture that this is not a normal classroom. You can see there's some old desks that were still in the room. Dewey had a hard time finding tables that were small for kids in school that many kids could sit around like we have today because they didn't make them. There's a famous story of Dewey going to a furniture store looking for tables for his students, and the person at the store said, "We only have tables that are made for listening," right, for students to be passive. And that said volumes to Dewey. So there's some traditional desks there, but you can see that the students are really engaged in things. They're doing hands-on things. There's what looks like a sandbox or a pile of dirt there in the middle of the room, other hands-on materials that they were using. They had to use a traditional classroom because that's what already existed, and some traditional materials, but you can see that does not look like, if you look at a traditional classroom photograph from 1896, it's not going to look like that, right? It's going to look like lots of kids sitting in rows, staring at the teacher or staring at a book, whatever it might be. So Dewey School does still exist at the University of Chicago. It's not really a Dewey School so much in its, teaching philosophy anymore. It's kind of up to the individual teachers. I know some teachers who teach there who still use Dewey's ideas a lot, but many of them don't. But it's still there. It's now a really good prep school. It's very expensive. The kids that go there, like the top, probably 25% of the kids that go there go to the top Ivy League schools and everything, because it has a reputation. Most of, I should say, a lot of the students there are either faculty of University of Chicago, kids of University of Chicago faculty, or they're people that live in downtown Chicago in the wealthy high-rises that send their kids in limousines to go to the school. But in Dewey's day, it was supposed to be for working class kids in the neighborhood where the school was located, which was right in the university area. As it says here, theoretical work and practice. Bringing theory and practice together is really important for Dewey, right? Theory should always go out of practice, grow out of it. Theory should not just be building castles in the sky, just detached from the real world, right? Theory should go out of practice. It should go back in and inform practice. And then practice should inform theory. And that's that whole learning cycle, right? And this is looking at it in a broader kind of way, right? That we generate ideas and beliefs and ways of thinking out of our hands-on experiences, right? And those help us to problem solve. So we apply them to practice. We learn from practice about those ideas and whether or not they really work. And we go back and we adjust our theory, right? So theory and practice work together. There's a word for that, a helpful word called praxis, P-R-A-X-I-S, praxis. That's about that combination of theory and practice. And it also says here the child came to school to do. Activities were based in craft activities and practical experiences. Now, again, this is not traditional vocational education as we think of it. This is not students doing hands-on learning for a specific job or vocation. They're doing hands-on learning. It's because it's a better way of learning about the world, right? And it's more interesting for students. And they're more theoretical learning. They're more abstract learning about, let's say, science and math and whatever else they're doing, grows out of that hands-on learning, right? And that's really the key to Dewey's view of learning. Um, let's see what else I had here for you briefly. Dewey was a close associate of somebody some of you may have heard about before from maybe a social studies or history class named Jane Addams. Jane Addams lived and worked in Chicago. She had what was called a settlement house for new immigrants in the western part of Chicago, where most of the immigrants lived. The immigrants who were coming to Chicago at the time, many of them were from the places that were discussed in the Tozer book as the places the new immigrants came from: Southern and Eastern Europe, right? Italian, Bulgarian, German, etc. People with very different languages and cultures than the people from Northern and Western Europe, right, who made up a lot of the earlier immigrants. And certainly a lot of the earliest immigrants were Anglo immigrants. And there were some immigrants from these other countries, but certainly the largest number of them were Anglo immigrants, first from Britain and then more from France, etc. But then you see more from Southern and Western Europe. And also from Asia, many immigrants from Asia. You might remember reading about the Chinese Exclusion Act, the horrible way in which the government completely just disenfranchised, but eventually decided to bar Chinese immigrants from coming into the country. They basically used IQ tests to do that. They would give IQ tests to these new immigrants who obviously were not going to be able to do well on them, to decide how many people from these various countries to let into this country. Our country had a eugenics office for a time. Eugenics is that theory that some people are naturally superior and others are naturally inferior. It was at the heart of Adolf Hitler's horrible kinds of discrimination and anti-Semitism against Jews and other people. Unfortunately, historians now understand that Adolf Hitler was actually inspired by the eugenics practices in this country. It's hard for a lot of people to believe that's the case, and we think of ourselves as a great immigrant nation, right, with the Statue of Liberty and taking in the huddled masses of the world, yearning to be free, etc. But as it said in the Tozer text, that was not the reality for a long time, and it's, as we know today, even today, that's not really the reality in many occasions, unfortunately. But the people that did make it into the country, many of them ended up moving to Chicago because there were no more jobs in the East Coast. They worked, many of them, in the meatpacking industry. That was really big in Chicago. The Armour Company, for example, was located in Chicago. Another big company located in Chicago was the Pullman Company. Pullman Company made sleeping cars for railroad trains. They were mentioned, I believe, in the Tozer text because of the big, it was kind of a factory town, and there was a big uprising there, and the National Guard came in or whatever. People were killed. It was a horrible sort of uprising. So there were a lot of worker uprisings and rebellions and things occurring, the rise of unions and a push for fair practices by companies in terms of worker safety, in terms of child labor laws. All these kinds of things did not exist. I know many people don't like unions today. But if it wasn't for unions, we wouldn't have a lot of the workplace safety and other kinds of laws that we have that allow workers to hopefully get fair pay, to work in a safe environment, and other kinds of things. And Jane Addams worked on the behalf of a lot of these people, and Dewey did as well. So she had this settlement house for these new immigrants, and it was both to help them adjust to the new environment they found themselves in, to assimilate to an extent, right? To be able to know what it means to be an American citizen and how to function successfully living in this country and living in Chicago, but also a place where they could still practice and maintain their culture, their language, etc. It had daycare for working families for their kids. It had activities for the kids. It was actually a very large rented home. It was basically a mansion that a family rented to Jane Addams. And it had an indoor theater. There was a swimming pool. It had classrooms, just all kinds of things for these families to come and kind of work and live together. Very famous. There are lots of books that have been written about Hull House. It was the second settlement house built in the country. The first one was in New York City, but Jane Addams had the second settlement house. And you can see her quote here: "The good we secure for ourselves is precarious and uncertain." Those are two very Deweyan words. "Until it is secured for all of us and incorporated into our common life." In other words, until everybody has what they need to really flourish as an individual, right? Food, shelter, education, a decent job, etc. The rest of society is going to suffer as well. We're all affected by poverty. We're all affected by crime, right? As they say, it takes less to educate somebody well than it does the money that costs to imprison them, right? We know many neighborhoods where there are not jobs, there's more crime, etc. And the nation is not as strong if our best and brightest are coming from all walks of life, right? We live in a meritocracy. We want people who have the ability, the talent, and virtue, as Jefferson said, to rise to the top. Well, if everybody's not given equal opportunity, we don't really have a meritocracy. So these are the kind of things that Jane Addams was talking here in this quotation. Dewey would do lectures sometimes at Hull House. This was part of his being a public intellectual, was being engaged there. Jane Addams was, many people want to argue, one of the first sociologists to really exist, real sociologists to exist in the world. The Chicago School of Sociology is well known. It was developing at the time. Jane Addams would actually collect data on issues of clean water, pollution, those kinds of things, available food, and let's say, stores and things for people in poor neighborhoods. And she would actually go to the mayor of Chicago and the different ward bosses and say, this is the kind of squalor people are living in. Here, I have some scientific data for you, right? This is what sociology is about, right? The science of how people live together. And actually had scientific data that she was allowed to use to actually leverage some change and make life better in some of these neighborhoods for these people that were living in Western Chicago, these recent immigrants in these really working class, poor neighborhoods. When she died, the whole city of Chicago shut down. And there were hundreds of thousands of people that showed up for her funeral. That's how popular and well-known she was in Chicago by the time she died. If you haven't heard about her before, just do a little quick research. I know there's a big Wikipedia page on Jane Addams, and there are other things that are available, but really an important figure, a public intellectual, a woman who was breaking boundaries at the time because of the kind of work that she was doing, being engaged in the public sphere, being a scientist, et cetera, at a time when very few women had the opportunity to be able to do that. You really had to be self-taught, really motivated and courageous as a woman at the time to really engage in these kinds of things. So Jane Addams is really important because of that. Lastly, there is also a big Wikipedia page on John Dewey's life and work that I've checked, and it's I know a lot of the people that have helped to write it, and it is very accurate, and it is a pretty good resource on Dewey's life and work for those of you who are interested in that topic. As it shows here, he visited China and Japan. His work is very popular there. His educational theory was popular there. His functional psychology, this is a part of his idea of interest and effort and the new psychology, as it was called, or constructivism. Other things having to do with his philosophy. He wrote on logic. He wrote on aesthetics. That's what my research has to deal mostly with. this citation here, number 53, actually is a citation to my own research on Dewey's work in the arts. Philanthropy, women, democracy was a great supporter of women intellectuals. He had women who were graduate students who worked with him at the University of Chicago. One of them was the grandmother of Jane Fowler Morse, who used to teach at Geneseo. She just retired this past year. Dewey really believed that the academic world was going to be very partial. It was not going to be complete in its perspective until more women and their perspectives and their experiences and their views were a part of, the public life and academic life, et cetera. Education, teacher education, you'll see there's a ton of stuff that's listed there. Just, some other things about Dewey. So that's also something you might want to check out. There's a journal of the John Dewey Society that I edited for years. I just finished 10 years of editing the journal. It was called Education and Culture. And that actually, articles from that are actually available, what's called open access from the Education and Culture website. If you go back to things that are more than 2 years old about Dewey's, life and work. Again, for those of you who, at this point, or again, because you're going to run across Dewey again in your other education classes, and certainly those of you who go on to become teachers and in your graduate work, et cetera, will want to cross Dewey some more. So that's why I wanted to give you a stronger background, and because obviously I'm very interested in Dewey's life and work. So that's my Dewey lecture. I hope you found that helpful and that it added to your reading of Interest and Effort in Education, and the Tozer text, that you can differentiate the new psychology of Dewey and Eliot from the faculty psychology of Mann and Jefferson, and also differentiate Dewey's developmental democracy progressivism from Charles Eliot's social efficiency progressivism. And so I hope that was helpful, and good luck with things as you work ahead. I just recently posted the responses to the group 4 discussion questions, to the chapter 4 discussion questions, so you should have those available, and hopefully you can match those up with the lecture and have everything that you need. Talk to you again during my next lecture. I think I have scheduled a couple more of them. At any point, if you have questions, remember to send me an email. I don't want people to feel like you're completely cut off from me and from getting the feedback you need. We can also set up Zoom conferences and feedback sessions if you'd like. So just feel free to email me and let me know about those things.